There is a particular cruelty reserved for those who are meant to love us most, a wound that cuts deeper than any stranger's slight ever could, for it comes from hands that should have offered shelter and instead chose to strike. Lady Eleanor Ashworth understood this truth intimately, had learned it in 1,000 small moments across her 23 years, in the way her mother's gaze would drift past her to settle adoringly upon her younger sister, in the way her father would forget to ask about her watercolors while praising Cordelia's every simpering accomplishment, in the way the world itself seemed to have decided, long before Eleanor had any say in the matter, that she was the shadow to her sister's light. She was not ugly. Precisely, her features were regular enough, her figure acceptable, her bearing graceful from years of careful cultivation. But beside Cordelia's golden curls and cornflower eyes, beside that porcelain complexion and rosebud mouth that seemed designed by Providence specifically to inspire poetry, Eleanor simply faded into the wallpaper of every room they shared. The Ashworth estate in Hertfordshire, Thornfield House, had once been grand, though now the grandeur showed its age in peeling paper and threadbare carpets, in rooms kept closed to save on coal and silver plate, quietly sold to meet the butcher's bills. Eleanor's father, Viscount Ashworth, maintained appearances with the desperate determination of a man watching his legacy crumble, while her mother focused all her remaining hopes on the daughters who might yet save them through advantageous marriages, or rather, on the one daughter beautiful enough to command such a rescue. Eleanor had made her peace with this, or so she told herself during the long, quiet hours she spent in the modest library that had become her sanctuary, losing herself in novels and histories and philosophical treatises that no one expected her to understand. Books never looked through her as though she were invisible, never compared her unfavorably to anyone, never made her feel that her worth as a person was somehow lessened by the arrangement of her features or the mouse-brown shade of her hair. She had her books, her correspondence with a former governess who had encouraged her mind, her small watercolors of the garden that no one but herself ever saw, and she had convinced herself that this was enough, that contentment could be built from such modest materials if one simply refused to want more. But even the most carefully constructed walls have their cracks, and Eleanor's had begun to fracture 6 months past, in a London ballroom filled with candlelight and music and the cruel laughter of those she had trusted, in a moment that had stripped away every comfortable lie she had told herself about not needing what she could not have, and had left her with nothing but the raw and bleeding truth of her own foolish heart. The wound had been inflicted on a spring evening 6 months past, in the glittering ballroom of Lady Pemberton's London townhouse, where Eleanor had allowed herself, for one brief and catastrophic season, to believe that perhaps she had been wrong about her place in the world. Lord Marcus Fairfax, Baron of Westmere, had sought her out at 3 successive gatherings, had asked her opinions on literature and politics, had laughed at her quiet wit and looked at her truly, looked at her as though she were worthy of being seen. He was handsome in that careless, golden way that seemed to come so easily to men of his station, all easy smiles and practiced charm, and Eleanor, starved as she was for any attention that did not come seasoned with pity or dismissal, had drunk in his regard like water in a desert. She had begun to dream, foolish creature that she was, of a future where someone had chosen her, had wanted her, had seen past the shadow she cast beside Cordelia to find something of value in the quieter sister. She had been standing behind a potted palm, having stepped away from the crush to catch her breath and calm her racing heart, before Marcus arrived for the dance he had requested, when she heard his voice drifting from the adjacent alcove, and Cordelia's tinkling laugh accompanying it like poisoned honey. "You cannot mean it," Cordelia had said, her tone dripping with the false modesty that fooled everyone except Eleanor. "You have been so very attentive to my sister these past weeks. I had quite convinced myself you preferred bookish conversation to beauty." Marcus's response had shattered something fundamental within Eleanor's chest, some last fragile hope she had not even known she still carried. "Your sister served her purpose admirably," he had said, and Eleanor could hear the smile in his voice, the casual cruelty of a man who had never once considered that his words might carry weight enough to wound. One cannot simply approach the most beautiful woman in any room without appearing overeager. It reeks of desperation, and desperation is so very unfashionable. But a few dances with the plain sister, a bit of conversation that costs nothing, and suddenly one has established oneself as a man of depth and discernment. Your mother was only too happy to facilitate the introductions, and Eleanor herself seemed pathetically grateful for the attention. It was almost too easy. Cordelia's laugh had rung out like a bell, bright and sharp, and utterly devoid of sisterly feeling. Poor Eleanor, useful for introductions and nothing more. She actually believed you might court her. I saw it in her face, that ridiculous hope, as though any man would choose her when I was in the room. Eleanor had stood frozen behind that palm, her white-gloved hands pressed against her mouth to contain the sound of her breaking, while the two of them continued their flirtation mere feet away, building their future happiness upon the foundation of her humiliation. She had not cried, not then, not where anyone might see and confirm what they already believed about her, that she was pitiable, desperate, reaching above her station, even to dream. Instead, she had slipped away through a servant's corridor, claimed a headache to her mother, and spent the carriage ride home staring at the dark London streets, while something within her quietly turned to stone. She would not be foolish again. She had promised herself that night. She would not hope, would not want, would not leave herself open to wounds that cut so deep they might never fully heal. She would expect nothing from love, and in expecting nothing, she would never again feel the devastating weight of its absence. The present had proven no kinder than the past, though Eleanor had learned to expect nothing else. 6 months had crawled by since that devastating evening at Lady Pemberton's ball, 6 months during which she had watched from the periphery as Cordelia and Marcus conducted their courtship with all the subtlety of a theatrical performance, their engagement announced with great fanfare, their wedding a lavish affair that had cost the family money they did not have and left Eleanor standing in dove-grey silk among the guests, smiling until her face ached, while her sister glowed in white satin and orange blossoms. They had married, those two shallow souls so perfectly suited to one another, and now Cordelia had taken to visiting Thornfield House with alarming frequency, sweeping through the rooms of their childhood home as Lady Fairfax, dropping casual mentions of her London townhouse and her husband's connections and the parties she attended where everyone who mattered could be found. Eleanor endured these visits with the stoic grace of a woman who had long since learned that showing pain only invited further wounds, retreating to her library whenever possible, counting the hours until Cordelia's carriage would finally roll away down the drive and leave her in peace. The family's circumstances, meanwhile, had deteriorated beyond what even Eleanor had imagined possible, her father's gambling debts finally coming to light in a series of increasingly desperate conversations conducted behind closed doors that were not quite thick enough to muffle her mother's weeping or her father's blustering. Excuses. Creditors had begun to circle like carrion birds, and the remaining silver had disappeared from the sideboard, and cook had been let go in favor of a single maid of all work who did her best but could not prevent the slow decay of a household running on nothing but pride and pretense. Eleanor had resigned herself to a future of genteel poverty, of perhaps seeking a position as a governess or companion once her parents were gone, of fading quietly into the margins of a world that had never had much use for her anyway. And then the letter had arrived, carried on a silver salver that had somehow escaped the creditor's notice, bearing a seal Eleanor did not recognize and containing an invitation that seemed to belong to someone else's life entirely. The Dowager Duchess of Ashworth, a distant relation on her mother's side so remote that Eleanor had never even heard the connection mentioned, requested the pleasure of their company in London for the remainder of the season, expressing a particular interest in becoming acquainted with the young ladies of the family. Eleanor's mother had nearly fainted with desperate hope, seeing in this unexpected summons one final chance to secure Eleanor's future before it was too late, before she aged past any possibility of marriage and became simply another burden on a family that could ill afford to carry her. Eleanor herself had agreed to go for reasons far less optimistic. She would travel to London not to find a husband she no longer believed existed for someone like her, but simply to escape the house where Cordelia reigned as visiting queen, to breathe air that did not taste of humiliation and broken dreams, to exist for a few weeks in a place where no one knew she was the plain sister, the overlooked one, the girl who had been fool enough to believe a handsome man might actually want her. London revealed itself to Eleanor in layers of soot and grandeur, the carriage rattling through streets that seemed to pulse with a vitality entirely foreign to the quiet decay of Thornfield House, and she pressed her face to the window like a child, despite her mother's tutting about propriety and appearances, drinking in the sight of a world that had never had reason to notice her existence. The Dowager Duchess of Ashworth's residence on Grosvenor Square, proved to be everything their own diminished circumstances were not: gleaming marble floors, footmen in immaculate livery, chandeliers that caught the afternoon light and scattered it like diamonds across silk-papered walls. And Eleanor felt acutely aware of her provincial dress and unfashionable bonnet as she was ushered into a drawing-room decorated with the casual elegance of truly old money. The dowager herself defied every expectation Eleanor had formed during the journey, for rather than the frail and fussy elderly relation she had imagined, she found herself facing a woman of perhaps 70 years who possessed eyes sharp as cut glass and a tongue, as Eleanor would soon discover, even sharper. "So you are the intelligent one," the dowager had announced within moments of their introduction, waving away Eleanor's mother with a flick of her bringed fingers and fixing Eleanor with an assessing stare that seemed to catalogue every thought she had ever had. "I have heard about the other one, the pretty sister who married that Fairfax fool, all beauty and no substance, from what my sources tell me, which means she shall be miserable within a year and deserve every moment of it. But you, child, you have something behind those eyes, something worth cultivating." Eleanor had not known how to respond to such forthright assessment, but the dowager had not seemed to require response, merely continuing her examination while asking questions about Eleanor's reading habits and opinions on matters, political and philosophical, questions no one had ever thought to ask her before. It was during her second week in London, at a musicale hosted by the Countess of Ravenswood, that Eleanor first beheld the dowager's grandson, and even across the crowded room she understood immediately why society whispered about Alexander Blackwood, the Duke of Ashworth, with such a mixture of fascination and fear. He stood apart from the glittering crowd, a tall figure in severe black evening clothes, his dark hair swept back from a face that might have been carved from marble for all the warmth it displayed, and when his gaze swept the room, it passed over the assembled guests with an indifference that bordered on contempt. "Cold as a winter grave," she overheard Lady Pemberton murmur to her companion, "but rich as Croesus and twice as powerful, so every mamma in London would sell her soul to see her daughter become his duchess." Eleanor watched him for a moment longer, noting the way lesser men seemed to shrink from his path, the way even the most determined debutantes faltered before his forbidding expression, and she felt nothing but a mild curiosity about what manner of man could inspire such universal intimidation. She did not dream of him that night, did not wonder about the mind behind those cold grey eyes, did not imagine for even a moment that his fate might become entangled with her own, for she had learned her lesson about hoping and dreaming, and the Duke of Ashworth existed in a sphere so far removed from her own that he might as well have been a character in one of her novels, interesting to observe from a safe distance, but utterly irrelevant to the quiet, diminished life she had accepted as her portion. The summons came on a Thursday afternoon, delivered by a footman in the Duke's livery, who presented Eleanor with a card requesting her presence in the dowager's private sitting-room at her earliest convenience, which was to say, immediately, and Eleanor had barely time to smooth her hair and pinch colour into her cheeks before she found herself standing before a door that seemed suddenly larger and more imposing than it had any right to be. The dowager was not alone, and Eleanor's heart performed a curious stutter when she realized that the tall figure standing by the window, silhouetted against the afternoon light, was none other than the Duke of Ashworth himself, his severe features rendered even more austere by the shadows that played across his face as he turned to regard her with those grey eyes that revealed nothing of the thoughts behind them. "Sit down, child," the dowager commanded, though not unkindly, and Eleanor obeyed on legs that felt oddly unsteady, folding her hands in her lap to hide their trembling while she waited for someone to explain why she had been brought here, why the most powerful man in England was studying her as if she were a ledger he was considering for purchase. "My grandson has a proposal for you," the dowager continued, and something in her tone suggested she found the situation amusing. "And I shall leave you to discuss it privately, though I expect you to hear him out before you make any decisions." She departed in a rustle of silk and lavender perfume, and then Eleanor was alone with the Duke, the silence between them stretching taut as a bowstring, until he finally spoke in a voice that was deep and measured and entirely without warmth. "I shall be direct, Lady Eleanor, as I understand you to be a woman who appreciates honesty over flattery," he began, moving away from the window to stand before the fireplace, his hands clasped behind his back in the manner of a man delivering a report rather than a romantic declaration. I require a wife, not a decoration for my arm or a simpering miss who will expect protestations of undying devotion. I am neither inclined nor equipped to provide. I need a companion of good breeding and sensible disposition, someone who will manage my household with intelligence and grace, who will not bore me with vapid conversation or exhaust me with emotional demands. Eleanor listened in stunned silence as he continued, outlining the terms of what he clearly viewed as a business arrangement. She would have unlimited access to his fortune, freedom to pursue her intellectual interests, security for herself and her family, a position in society that would shield her from every petty cruelty she had ever endured. In exchange, she would bear his name, and eventually his heirs, would stand beside him at social functions, would be a duchess in truth and not merely in title. I do not offer you love, he said finally, his eyes meeting hers with an intensity that belied the coolness of his words, for I am not certain I possess the capacity for such sentiment, but I offer you respect and stability, and the freedom to live as you choose within the bounds of propriety. Take time to consider, if you require it. Eleanor did consider, though not for long, for what was there to deliberate when her heart had already proven itself a faithless guide, and her prospects consisted of genteel poverty or positions of servitude in other people's homes. She thought of Cordelia's mocking laughter, of Marcus's casual cruelty, of all the romantic dreams that had curdled into ash, and she recognized in this strange, cold man's offer something she had never expected, to find the chance to be valued for her mind rather than dismissed for her face, to be chosen deliberately rather than settled for reluctantly. I accept, she heard herself say, and if her voice trembled slightly, neither of them acknowledged it. When she told her mother that evening, the woman wept with joy and relief, and her father clasped her hands with a gratitude that spoke volumes about just how desperate their circumstances had become, and Eleanor told herself that she had made a practical decision, a wise decision, that expecting nothing meant she could never again be disappointed. She did not allow herself to wonder why the Duke had chosen her, or what secrets might lurk behind those impenetrable grey eyes, for such wondering was the province of romantic fools, and Eleanor Ashworth had learned her lesson about romance. The news travelled with the swiftness that only truly delicious gossip can achieve, carried on the wings of whispered confidences and morning calls and hastily penned letters, and so it was that Cordelia descended upon the dowager's residence, a mere 3 days after the engagement was announced, her beautiful face arranged in an expression of sisterly concern that fooled no one who possessed eyes to see or wit to perceive. "Dearest Eleanor," she exclaimed, sweeping into the drawing-room in a confection of rose silk that perfectly complemented her golden curls, "I simply had to come the moment I heard the news, for I could scarcely believe it when Marcus told me you, engaged to the Duke of Ashworth, the very same man all of London has whispered about for years as utterly incapable of human warmth or feeling." She settled herself on the settee with the practiced grace of a woman who knew precisely how lovely she appeared, her eyes sweeping over Eleanor's modest morning dress with barely concealed contempt. "I suppose congratulations are in order, though I confess myself astonished that such a man would choose so unexpectedly. One wonders what could possibly have recommended you to his attention when he might have had any beauty in England." Eleanor felt the familiar sting of her sister's barbs, but found, somewhat to her own surprise, that they penetrated less deeply than they once had, as if the Duke's practical regard had begun to form a shield she had not known she needed. "The Duke values qualities beyond mere appearance," she replied quietly, her hands steady in her lap though her heart raced with the effort of maintaining composure, "and I am content with the arrangement we have made." Cordelia's laugh rang out like shattering crystal, bright and brittle, and edged with something that might have been disbelief, or might have been the first stirrings of envy, at finding her overlooked sister elevated so far beyond her own position. "Content," she repeated, savouring the word as if it were a confession of failure. How perfectly tragic, to enter a marriage aspiring to nothing more than contentment. "You'll regret this match, Eleanor. Mark my words, a man like that, cold as ice, incapable of love or passion. At least Marcus desired me, wanted me, pursued me with all the ardour a woman could wish." She leaned forward, her voice dropping to a confidential murmur that dripped with poisoned honey. "He will never love you, sister. He has chosen you precisely because you will not inspire feelings he has no wish to experience. You shall be a housekeeper with a title, nothing more." Eleanor thought of Marcus Fairfax, of whispered cruelties overheard in moonlit gardens, of a heart broken so thoroughly she had believed it beyond repair. And she looked at her beautiful sister, who had taken everything Eleanor had ever wanted, and felt something shift within her chest. Not quite pity, not yet, but the first recognition that beauty without kindness was a hollow victory. "Perhaps," Eleanor said, rising to indicate the visit was concluded, "but I have learned that there are worse fates than a marriage built on respect rather than romantic illusion." Cordelia departed in a flurry of silk and indignation, her parting words a prophecy of misery that Eleanor tucked away in the quiet corners of her mind. And if she wondered in the darkness of her chamber that night whether her sister might be right, whether she was trading one form of loneliness for another, she reminded herself firmly that she had asked for nothing but security, and security was precisely what she would receive. The wedding took place on a morning in late spring, when the cathedral seemed to hold its breath in anticipation, sunlight streaming through ancient stained glass to cast patterns of ruby and gold across the stone floor where Eleanor stood in ivory silk, her hands trembling only slightly as she spoke, vows that would bind her to a man she barely knew, but had chosen to trust with her future. Alexander was resplendent in dark, formal attire, his expression as unreadable as ever, though Eleanor thought she detected something almost like uncertainty in the set of his shoulders. As he slid the ring upon her finger, a band of gold, set with sapphires that matched the necklace the dowager had pressed upon her that morning, with tears in her sharp old eyes. The ceremony passed in a blur of incense and organ music and faces she did not recognize, and then she was a duchess, her hand resting in the crook of her husband's arm as they processed down the aisle, past pews filled with the cream of English society, all of whom had come to witness the inexplicable match between the cold duke and the plain Ashworth girl. The wedding breakfast was elegant and interminable, and Eleanor smiled until her face ached. Accepted congratulations she suspected were more curious than sincere, and counted the hours until she might escape to whatever her new life would become. The carriage ride to Blackwood Manor took the better part of a day, during which Alexander sat across from her reading correspondence, while Eleanor watched the countryside transform from London's grey sprawl to rolling green hills, and finally to the vast parkland that announced the Duke's ancestral seat. The manor itself stole her breath, a magnificent edifice of honey-coloured stone that seemed to have grown from the very earth it commanded, its countless windows glinting in the fading light like watchful eyes. That first night, Eleanor had braced herself for the duty she knew marriage required, had steeled her nerves and her heart for an intimacy she did not feel ready to share, but Alexander had merely escorted her to a suite of rooms more luxurious than any she had ever imagined, and bid her good night at the door with a formality that bordered on gentleness. "There is no rush," he had said, his grey eyes meeting hers with something she could not quite decipher. "Take whatever time you need to feel at home here." In the weeks that followed, Eleanor discovered that Blackwood Manor was less a prison than she had feared, and more a sanctuary than she had dared hope, its vast library becoming her particular refuge, its manicured grounds offering endless paths for contemplation. Alexander remained a courteous stranger, joining her for dinner each evening, where their conversation touched upon books and estate matters and nothing of consequence, yet Eleanor began to notice small kindnesses she could not quite attribute to coincidence. A vase of primroses appearing in her sitting room when she had mentioned missing the wildflowers of her childhood home, a volume of poetry she had admired in the library, finding its way to her bedside table, her favorite dishes appearing at meals, though she could not recall expressing her preferences aloud. The staff, initially wary of their new mistress, began to warm to her quiet kindness, and Mrs. Pemberton, the housekeeper, confided that the household had not felt so peaceful in years, though Eleanor could not imagine what storms might have preceded her arrival to make her unremarkable presence seem so welcome. It was on an afternoon in early summer that Eleanor first glimpsed the man her husband truly was, and the discovery came not through any grand revelation, but through the simple act of following a path she had not yet explored, one that wound through the eastern woods and emerged at the cluster of tenant cottages that bordered the estate's farmland. She had not intended to spy, had merely been walking off the restlessness that had begun to plague her in recent days, a restlessness she refused to examine too closely when she heard voices carrying through the open window of the nearest cottage and recognized, with a start of surprise, the deep tones of Alexander's voice speaking with a gentleness she had never heard him employ. Eleanor drew closer, concealing herself behind the thick trunk of an ancient oak, and watched through the cottage window as her husband knelt beside a small bed where a child of perhaps 6 years lay pale and listless, his mother hovering anxiously nearby. "The physician will return tomorrow," Alexander was saying, his hand resting with infinite care upon the boy's forehead. "And I have sent to London for the medicine he requires. It should arrive by evening. And you must not worry about the cost, for there is no cost. Only the hope that young Thomas here will be chasing rabbits through my gardens again by week's end and causing my groundskeeper to despair." The child managed a weak smile, and Alexander produced from his pocket a small wooden horse, carved with evident skill, which he pressed into the boy's thin fingers with a solemnity that suggested he was bestowing a knighthood rather than a toy. Eleanor felt something crack open within her chest, some wall she had not known she was still maintaining, as she watched this man whom society called cold and unfeeling sit with a sick tenant child, as if there were nowhere else in the world he needed to be. She slipped away before she could be discovered, but she could not slip away from the questions that now pursued her with relentless insistence. Who was this man she had married, and how had she so thoroughly misunderstood him? In the days that followed, Eleanor began to pay attention in ways she had not before, noting how the servants spoke of the Duke, not with the fearful deference she had observed in other great houses, but with genuine warmth and loyalty, how the tenants touched their caps with respect rather than anxiety when he rode past, how the elderly groundskeeper's cottage had been fitted with a new roof, though the man had never requested one. At dinner that evening, when Alexander inquired about the book, she was reading a volume of essays on natural philosophy that most men would have considered unsuitable for feminine consumption. She found herself sharing her thoughts with an openness that surprised her, and more surprising still was the way he listened, truly listened, his grey eyes focused upon her face with an intensity that made her feel, for the first time in her life, that her mind was worthy of attention. "You have a remarkable intellect," he said quietly when she had finished explaining her disagreement with one of the essayist's conclusions, and though there was nothing of flirtation in his tone, Eleanor felt warmth bloom across her cheeks and something flutter dangerously in the region of her heart, something that felt perilously like the beginning of feelings she had sworn never to entertain again. The invitation came on a morning when summer had reached its full glory, the gardens of Blackwood Manor ablaze with roses, and the air thick with the scent of honeysuckle, and Eleanor looked up from her correspondence to find Alexander standing in the doorway of her sitting room with an expression she had come to recognize as uncertainty disguised as formality. "I thought you might care to ride out with me this morning," he said, his voice carrying that careful neutrality she now understood was his armor against the world. "There are parts of the estate you have not yet seen, and the weather is fine." Eleanor agreed with a pleasure she did not quite manage to conceal, and within the hour they were mounted and moving through the parkland at an easy pace, Alexander on his great black stallion, and Eleanor on the gentle grey mare he had procured for her shortly after their wedding, another of those thoughtful gestures she had learned to recognize as his particular language of care. They rode first through the home woods, where dappled light fell through ancient oaks, and the only sounds were birdsong and the soft thud of hooves upon the forest floor, and then out across rolling hills that seemed to stretch endlessly beneath a sky of perfect summer blue. Alexander spoke of the land as they rode, pointing out boundaries and features with the knowledge of a man who had walked every inch of his inheritance, but gradually the conversation turned to other things, to books they had both read, to opinions they discovered they shared, to memories that emerged slowly, like creatures venturing forth from long hibernation. "My father believed that sentiment was the province of lesser men," Alexander said at one point, his gaze fixed upon the distant horizon, his voice carrying an old pain that Eleanor recognized because she carried her own. "He considered any display of emotion to be weakness, and he was not gentle in teaching that lesson." Eleanor listened as he spoke of a childhood spent in magnificent rooms that held no warmth, of a mother who had died when he was 7 and whose memory his father had forbidden him to mention, of learning to build walls so thick and so high that eventually he forgot there had ever been anything behind them worth protecting. She shared her own stories in return, speaking cautiously at first, and then with growing trust of being the daughter who was never quite enough, of watching Cordelia receive the love and attention she had craved, of the humiliation that had taught her to expect nothing so that she might never be wounded by disappointment again. Their horses had slowed to a walk, moving side by side along a ridge that overlooked a valley of extraordinary beauty, and when Alexander reached across to adjust her reins, an unnecessary gesture, for Eleanor was a competent horsewoman, his gloved hand brushed against hers, and neither of them moved away, the contact holding for one breath and then two before the horses shifted and the moment passed. That evening, the Dowager Duchess joined them for dinner and watched the two of them with eyes that missed nothing, a small smile playing about her lips as she observed the way Alexander's gaze followed Eleanor across the room, the way Eleanor's cheeks flushed when their eyes met. "You have done well, my dear," the Dowager murmured to Eleanor as they withdrew after the meal, leaving Alexander to his port. "Better than you know, I suspect." Eleanor lay awake that night, reminding herself sternly that this was a practical arrangement, that she had accepted security and respect, and must not be foolish enough to hope for more. But her heart refused to listen, beating with a rhythm that felt dangerously like the beginning of something she had sworn she would never feel again. The journey to London marked a threshold, Eleanor felt, with every mile that passed beneath the carriage wheels, each turn of the road carrying her closer to a world that had once dismissed her and must now receive her as one of its most elevated members. And though she sat composed beside Alexander, her gloved hands folded neatly in her lap, her heart raced with an anxiety she could not entirely suppress. She would be judged, she knew, scrutinized by 1,000 critical eyes that would measure her against every diamond of the first water, every celebrated beauty, every woman who had ever set her cap at the elusive Duke of Ashworth and failed to capture his attention. The ton would wonder what he had seen in her, this plain, quiet creature who had languished on the shelf while her beautiful sister made a brilliant match, and Eleanor found herself bracing for the whispers, the raised eyebrows, the pitying glances that would suggest the Duke had made a peculiar choice indeed. They arrived at Ashworth House as twilight painted the London sky in shades of rose and gold, the magnificent townhouse rising before them like a monument to generations of wealth and power, and Eleanor felt suddenly small as footmen rushed to attend them, and the butler bowed with solemn deference to his master and new mistress. The days that followed were consumed with preparations, fittings with modistes, who treated her with a respect that still felt foreign, consultations about menus and guest lists, lessons in the particular protocols expected of a duchess, and through it all, Alexander remained a steady presence, appearing at odd moments to inquire after her comfort or to share some observation that made her smile despite her nervousness. It was on the evening before their first ball that he came to her sitting room, carrying a velvet case of such obvious significance that Eleanor's breath caught in her throat, and when he opened it to reveal a parure of sapphires set in gold necklace, earrings, bracelet, and tiara, each piece a masterwork of the jeweller's art, she could only stare in wordless astonishment at gems that seemed to hold captured starlight within their depths. "They match your eyes," Alexander said quietly, something uncertain flickering behind his customary reserve, "and I thought it fitting that society should see the treasure I have found, even if they lack the discernment to recognize its true worth without assistance." Eleanor felt tears prick at her eyes and blinked them back fiercely, unsure how to interpret this gesture, whether it was merely the expected generosity of a duke toward his duchess, or something more, something that made her heart ache with a hope she still feared to name. The ball itself was a glittering crush of London's finest, hundreds of candles blazing in crystal chandeliers, the scent of hothouse flowers mingling with expensive perfumes, music swelling from the orchestra as couples took to the floor in elegant formations. Eleanor felt the weight of every gaze as they entered, heard the whispers that rippled through the crowd like wind through wheat, but Alexander's hand remained warm and steady at the small of her back, guiding her forward with a quiet authority that seemed to dare anyone to question his choice. And for the first time in her life, Eleanor understood what it meant to feel truly protected. They had danced twice and were standing near the refreshment table when Eleanor saw them approaching through the crowd, Cordelia resplendent in rose silk that complemented her golden beauty, and Marcus at her side with that easy smile Eleanor had once foolishly believed was meant for her, and she felt her stomach clench with an old familiar dread even as she lifted her chin and arranged her features into an expression of polite welcome. "Eleanor, darling sister," Cordelia purred, her eyes sweeping over Eleanor's gown, the sapphires at her throat, with an assessment that was both hungry and dismissive. "How grand you look, one would almost not recognize you, so transformed by your new circumstances, though I confess the sapphires are rather overwhelming for someone of your coloring, do you not think?" The words were delivered with a smile that did not reach her eyes, and Eleanor felt the familiar sting of her sister's casual cruelty, the way Cordelia had always known precisely where to place her barbs for maximum effect. "Lady Fairfax," Alexander said, his voice carrying that particular quality of ice that Eleanor had learned he reserved for those who displeased him, "how kind of you to offer your opinion on matters of which you have neither knowledge nor taste." Cordelia's smile faltered for just a moment before she recovered, turning to Marcus with a tinkling laugh that rang false in the suddenly attentive air around them. For others had begun to notice the exchange, heads turning and conversations pausing as the Tun sensed the delicious possibility of scandal. "Your grace is too severe," Cordelia continued, her voice carrying just enough to be heard by those nearby. "I meant only that Eleanor has always been better suited to quieter pursuits, books and such, rather than the glittering world of society, and one cannot help but wonder if she finds it all rather exhausting, pretending to belong in a sphere so far above her natural inclinations." The silence that followed was absolute, and Eleanor felt the eyes of 100 guests upon her, felt the old shame rising in her throat, the certainty that everyone was thinking what Cordelia had implied, that she was an impostor, a plain woman who had somehow stumbled into a position she did not deserve and could not hope to maintain. But before she could speak, before she could summon the words to defend herself, Alexander moved, stepping slightly forward in a gesture that was somehow both subtle and unmistakably protective. And when he spoke, his voice carried across the ballroom with an authority that commanded absolute attention. "I have married the most remarkable woman in this room," he said, each word precise and deliberate, his gaze sweeping across the assembled company before settling with unmistakable contempt upon Marcus, "and any man who failed to see her worth has only revealed his own deficiency of character, a deficiency that, I suspect, provides its own punishment in time." The ballroom had gone utterly still, and Eleanor watched as Marcus flushed a deep, mottled red, as Cordelia's painted smile crumbled into something closer to shock, as the whispers began to ripple outward through the crowd in waves of barely suppressed excitement. Alexander turned to Eleanor then, extending his hand with a formal grace that somehow felt infinitely tender, and she placed her fingers in his and allowed him to lead her onto the dance floor as the orchestra struck up a waltz, and as they moved together through the figures, she found herself blinking back tears that she refused to let fall, her heart so full of gratitude and something far more dangerous that she could scarcely breathe for the weight of it. The carriage ride home was conducted in a silence that felt neither uncomfortable nor complete, the wheels rattling over cobblestones as the London night flowed past the windows in a blur of gaslight and shadow, and Eleanor found herself acutely aware of Alexander's presence beside her, the warmth of him, the faint scent of his cologne, the way his gloved hands rested upon his knees with that characteristic stillness that she had come to recognize as a kind of armor against the world. She knew she should speak, should find some way to express the tumult of emotion that threatened to overwhelm her, but the words tangled in her throat, inadequate to convey what it had meant to hear him defend her so publicly, so absolutely, in front of the very people who had always looked through her as though she were made of glass. "Your Grace," she finally managed, her voice emerging smaller and less steady than she had intended, "I must thank you for what you said tonight. I know it cannot have been comfortable to make such a scene, and I am grateful beyond my ability to express." He turned to look at her then, and in the flickering light from the carriage lamps, she thought she saw something shift behind his eyes, something almost vulnerable before his customary reserve settled back into place like a door closing. "There is nothing to thank me for," he said quietly. "I spoke only the truth, and it is a truth that should never have required speaking. Any person of sense would recognize your worth without prompting." The dismissal of her gratitude should have stung, but Eleanor understood, somehow, that this was simply his way, that accepting thanks for what he considered basic decency was as foreign to him as the easy expressions of affection that came so naturally to others, and she felt her heart ache with a tenderness that frightened her with its intensity. They arrived at Ashworth House and walked together through the grand entrance hall, the servants melting away with practiced discretion, and as they climbed the stairs toward their separate chambers, Eleanor became aware that Alexander had slowed his pace, that they had stopped in the corridor, where the candlelight cast dancing shadows on the silk-papered walls, and when she turned to bid him good night, she found him closer than expected, his eyes searching her face with an intensity that stole her breath. For one suspended moment, she was certain he would kiss her. She could see the intention in the slight parting of his lips, feel it in the way the air between them seemed to thicken with possibility. But then something flickered across his features, something that looked almost like fear, and he stepped back, his bow formal, his good night. Eleanor, carrying an edge of roughness that she had never heard before. She lay awake for hours after, staring at the canopy above her bed while her mind replayed every moment of the evening, his words, his touch, that almost kiss, and finally, in the quiet honesty of darkness, she allowed herself to name the truth she had been fighting since those first unexpected kindnesses at Blackwood Manor, since the flowers in her favorite colors, and the books that appeared like magic, and the gentle way he had asked nothing of her but her presence. She loved him. She, who had sworn never to be foolish again, who had accepted this marriage as a practical arrangement and nothing more, had fallen completely and irrevocably in love with her husband, and the realization brought not joy but terror. For what if he never felt the same? What if Cordelia had been right, and she would spend her life longing for warmth from a man made of ice? Yet even as she feared, she remembered the way he had looked at her tonight, the fierce protectiveness in his voice, and she dared to wonder if perhaps, just perhaps, there might be hope after all. In the days that followed, society talked of nothing else. The Duke of Ashworth's unprecedented public declaration, his obvious devotion to his unlikely Duchess and invitations arrived at Ashworth House in floods, everyone suddenly eager to know the woman who had captured the heart of England's most elusive bachelor, and Eleanor, who had spent her life being overlooked, found herself at last being seen. The weeks that followed the Hartington ball unfolded like the pages of a story Eleanor had never dared to imagine for herself, each day bringing new evidence of a transformation she could scarcely comprehend, small moments accumulating like precious stones in a treasury she had not known she possessed. It began with the tea she had developed, a habit of reading late into the night, curled in the window seat of the library at Ashworth House with a blanket across her lap and a candle burning low, and one evening she looked up from her book to find Alexander standing in the doorway, a cup and saucer in his hands, his expression carrying that particular quality of uncertainty that she had come to recognize as his way of offering something he feared might be rejected. "You will strain your eyes," he said quietly, crossing to set the tea beside her, and she noticed that it was prepared exactly as she preferred it, with honey rather than sugar, and a precise amount of cream, details she had never mentioned but that he had somehow observed, and when she thanked him, he merely nodded and withdrew, but not before she caught the faintest softening around his eyes that made her heart turn over in her chest. She began to notice other things too, the way he would appear at her side during social engagements whenever conversation grew tedious or company grew tiresome, offering escape with a perfectly timed suggestion that they were needed elsewhere. The way he listened when she spoke of the books she was reading, asking questions that revealed he had been paying attention to her interests in a way that no one else in her life ever had. The way his hand would find hers beneath the table at dinner parties, a secret touch that sent warmth spreading through her entire being, while their faces revealed nothing to the watching world. One evening at Lady Pemberton's musicale, when the soprano had been particularly shrill and the evening particularly long, Eleanor caught Alexander's eye across the room and saw her own thoughts, reflected their amusement, endurance, the shared understanding of two people who had somehow become conspirators in the performance of social obligation, and when she pressed her lips together to suppress a smile, she saw him do the same, and in that moment of silent communion she felt more intimately connected to another person than she had ever felt in her life. The dowager, who missed nothing, remarked upon it during a morning call, her sharp eyes gleaming with satisfaction as she observed them together in the drawing-room. "I have never seen my grandson smile so much," she declared, her tone carrying equal parts wonder and vindication, "and I have certainly never seen him seek out anyone's company the way he seeks out yours. You have accomplished what I had begun to fear. Impossible, my dear, and I find myself quite overcome with gratitude." Eleanor demurred, uncertain how to respond, but the dowager's words stayed with her, feeding a hope she tried desperately to contain. Then came the gift that undid her entirely, a first edition of Miss Austen's Pride and Prejudice, presented without ceremony one morning at breakfast, Alexander sliding it across the table with an expression that suggested he found the gesture unremarkable when Eleanor knew, she knew, that such a volume must have required months of searching, letters to booksellers across the continent, expense and effort far beyond any reasonable measure. "You mentioned it was your favorite," he said simply when she stared at him with tears threatening to spill, and Eleanor understood then that she was not merely falling in love with her husband, she had already fallen, completely and irrevocably, and the only question that remained was whether she would ever find the courage to tell him so. The storm arrived without warning on an evening in late May, the sky darkening with unnatural swiftness as Eleanor sat in the small parlour adjacent to her bedchamber, attempting without success to focus on the embroidery in her lap, while the first distant rumbles of thunder sent tremors of dread through her body that no amount of rational thought could quell. She had feared storms since childhood, since a night when lightning had struck the old oak outside her nursery window, and she had woken to fire and screaming, and her nurse's arms carrying her through smoke-filled corridors, and though she knew the fear was foolish, knew that Ashworth House was solid and safe, and that no harm would come to her, still her hands trembled, and her breath came short as the wind began to howl against the windows, and the thunder grew closer, louder, until it seemed to shake the very walls around her. She had risen to pace, unable to remain still, her arms wrapped around herself as if she could hold her composure together through sheer physical pressure. When the door opened and Alexander appeared, still dressed in the clothes he had worn to dinner, his expression shifting from inquiry to immediate understanding as he took in her pallor, her trembling, the way she flinched when lightning illuminated the room in harsh white light. He said nothing, asked no questions, offered no platitudes about the irrationality of fear, simply crossed to the settee and sat, then looked at her with quiet expectation until she found herself sinking down beside him, close enough that she could feel the warmth of him, the solid steadiness of his presence like an anchor in the chaos of the storm. And then he began to talk, his voice low and even, telling her about the history of Blackwood Manor, about the gardens his mother had planted and the folly his grandfather had built, about the tenant farmer whose prize pig had once escaped and been found sleeping in the chapel. And Eleanor found herself listening, found her breathing slowing to match the rhythm of his words, found the terror receding as his voice wove a cocoon of calm around her that the thunder could not penetrate. When at last the storm began to fade, the thunder growing distant and the rain settling into a gentle patter against the glass, Eleanor became aware that at some point she had leaned into him, that his arm had come around her shoulders, that they sat together in an intimacy more profound than any they had yet shared. She lifted her head and found his eyes upon her, dark and deep and filled with something that made her heart cease its beating, and slowly, so slowly, he raised his hand to touch her face, his fingers brushing her cheek with a tenderness that brought tears to her eyes, and then he withdrew, rising, his bow formal, even as something in his expression seemed to crack, and his "good night." Eleanor was rough with an emotion she could not name, as he left her alone with the dying storm and a certainty crystallizing in her mind. He was holding himself back, restraining something that longed to break free, and she would not rest until she understood why, until she had found a way through those final walls he maintained even now, even after everything, even when his eyes told her what his words would not. They returned to Blackwood Manor in early June, the London season having grown wearisome in its endless parade of social obligations, and Eleanor found herself breathing more freely as their carriage passed through the great iron gates, and the familiar vista of rolling parkland opened before them, green and peaceful and wonderfully removed from the exhausting performance of society. The days that followed settled into a rhythm of quiet contentment. Mornings spent in the library or walking the gardens, afternoons riding across the estate, evenings dining together with conversation that flowed more easily now, though still there remained between them that careful distance, that sense of words unspoken and truths held close. It was on such an evening, a week after their return, that Alexander suggested a walk in the gardens after dinner, his voice carrying an unusual hesitancy that made Eleanor's heart quicken with something she could not name. The moon hung full and luminous above them as they walked the gravel paths between the roses, their fragrance heavy in the warm night air, and Eleanor was acutely aware of Alexander beside her, of the measured pace of his steps, of the tension she could feel radiating from him, like heat from a banked fire. When they reached the stone bench beneath the ancient oak at the garden's heart, he stopped, and in the silver moonlight his face appeared younger somehow, stripped of its usual severity, vulnerable in a way she had never seen. "Eleanor," he said, and her name on his lips sounded almost like a prayer. "I must ask you something, and I find myself—" He paused, a muscle working in his jaw, and she waited, scarcely breathing, as he gathered himself and began again. "Are you content? In this marriage, in this life, have I given you what I promised? Security, respect, freedom to pursue your interests?" She answered carefully, speaking of gratitude, of comfort, of the unexpected kindness she had found in what she had expected to be merely a practical arrangement. But even as the words left her lips, she saw something shift in his expression, something that looked almost like pain, and he raised his hand to stop her. "I am not," his voice caught, and he looked away, toward the moonlit gardens, and when he spoke again, the words came haltingly, as if each one cost him dearly. "I was taught that emotion was weakness. My father believed it, practiced it, instilled it in me so thoroughly that I believed it too. Believed that to feel deeply was to be vulnerable, to be foolish, to invite the kind of pain my mother's death brought him. I proposed a practical arrangement because I did not believe myself capable of more." He turned to face her then, and Eleanor saw in his eyes something that stole the breath from her body. "I was wrong, Eleanor. I do not know how to speak of these things, do not know the pretty words that other men might offer, but you must know you have become everything to me. I love you. I love you in a way I did not believe possible, and I ask nothing in return, expect nothing, only that you know the truth of what you have awakened in me." And Eleanor, her eyes filling with tears that caught the moonlight as they spilled down her cheeks, reached for him at last, her hands finding his, her voice trembling as she confessed her own love, her fear of hoping, the joy that now flooded through her like sunlight breaking through clouds after an endless winter. And in that moonlit garden, beneath the ancient oak, two hearts that had learned to guard themselves finally, blessedly, found the courage to be open. The kiss, when it came, was everything Eleanor had never dared to dream tender at first, almost questioning, as if Alexander still could not quite believe she had given him permission to hope, and then deepening into something that stole her breath and set her heart racing as his arms came around her and drew her close against the solid warmth of his chest. And she realized that all those months of careful distance, of restrained courtesy, of longing glances quickly shuttered, had been building to this moment, this perfect shattering of every wall between them. When at last they broke apart, both trembling, Alexander rested his forehead against hers and whispered her name with a reverence that made tears spring fresh to her eyes, and then without a word he swept her into his arms as if she weighed nothing at all, and carried her through the moonlit garden, through the quiet corridors of Blackwood Manor, where only a few flickering candles lit their way, to the chamber they would now share, not as strangers bound by contract, but as husband and wife, in the truest, most sacred sense of the words. What passed between them that night was not the awkward fulfillment of duty Eleanor had once resigned herself to expect, but rather a revelation, his hands gentle and sure as they learned the landscape of her, his whispered words of love and wonder warming her skin wherever they fell, her own tentative touches growing bolder as she discovered the man beneath the Duke's austere exterior, passionate and tender and trembling with the force of emotions so long suppressed. They came together with a sweetness that transcended the merely physical, two souls recognizing in each other the home they had searched for all their lives. And when Eleanor cried out, it was from joy as much as pleasure, from the overwhelming rightness of being held by a man who saw her, truly saw her, and found her worthy of love. Afterward, they lay tangled together in the moonlight that streamed through the tall windows, her head upon his chest, where she could hear the steady rhythm of his heart, and they spoke in whispers of hopes and dreams and futures they would build together, of children who would know both strength and tenderness, of years stretching before them like an unwritten book, waiting to be filled with happiness, of the miracle that had brought them from a practical arrangement to this profound and unexpected love. When dawn crept golden through the curtains, Eleanor woke to find Alexander watching her with an expression of such naked adoration that she laughed aloud from pure joy. And he smiled, truly smiled, the expression transforming his severe features into something beautiful and drew her close for a kiss that promised this was only the beginning. They breakfasted together in her sitting room, feeding each other bites of toast and speaking of small pleasures as if they had been married in truth for years, and Eleanor understood at last what it meant to find home not in a place but in a person, to know with absolute certainty that whatever trials the future might bring, she would face them with this man beside her, and that the practical arrangement Cordelia had mocked had become the greatest blessing of her life. The grand ball hosted by the Duke and Duchess of Ashworth at their London residence in late June was declared by all who attended to be the most magnificent event of the season, but Eleanor, standing beside Alexander in the receiving line, as hundreds of the Tun's most illustrious members passed before them with congratulations and compliments, cared nothing for the elaborate flower arrangements imported from 3 countries, or the orchestra brought specially from Vienna, or the champagne flowing like water through the glittering rooms. She cared only for the warmth of her husband's hand at the small of her back, for the way his eyes found hers across crowded conversations with a look that spoke of secrets shared and promises kept, for the knowledge that she was loved, truly and completely loved, by this man who had once seemed so cold and unknowable. She moved through the evening with a confidence she had never possessed before, accepting compliments with grace, engaging in conversation with wit and warmth, aware that society watched her with new eyes, now not as the plain sister, not as the overlooked spinster who had somehow stumbled into an advantageous match, but as the Duchess of Ashworth, a woman who had captured the heart of a man many had believed possessed none. It was near midnight when Cordelia appeared at her elbow, resplendent in an elaborate gown that could not quite disguise the tightness around her mouth or the shadows beneath her eyes, and Eleanor felt something shift in her chest as she regarded her sister, not the old familiar sting of inadequacy, not even the satisfaction of vindication she might have expected, but rather a quiet, unexpected pity. Marcus's gambling had become the subject of much whispered speculation, their debts mounting, their marriage visibly strained. And Cordelia's beauty, which had always been her greatest currency, could not purchase the happiness that eluded her. "Quite the triumph, sister," Cordelia said, her voice carrying that familiar edge of false sweetness, "though I confess I still cannot fathom what the Duke sees in you, but then, men can be so peculiar in their tastes." And Eleanor, secure in the fortress of her husband's love, found she could smile genuinely, could respond with kindness, rather than the cutting retort that might once have been her only defense. "I hope you find contentment, Cordelia," she said simply, and watched her sister's face contort with something that looked almost like anguish before she swept away into the crowd. Later, as the evening reached its height, Alexander raised his glass and called for silence, and the magnificent ballroom fell quiet as hundreds of faces turned toward the Duke and his Duchess. "I am not a man given to public declarations," he said, his deep voice carrying clearly through the hushed room, "but tonight I must speak what society should know, that in Eleanor I have found not merely a wife, but a partner of extraordinary worth, a woman of intelligence and kindness and quiet strength, and I count myself the most fortunate man in England to have won her regard." The applause that followed was thunderous, but Eleanor heard none of it, saw only Alexander's face as he turned to her, saw the love written there as clearly as words upon a page, and knew that she had found, in the most unexpected of arrangements, everything her heart had ever desired. 3 years had passed since that magical night in the moonlit garden when 2 guarded hearts had finally spoken their truth, and Blackwood Manor had transformed from a place of quiet formality into a home alive with warmth and laughter and the patter of small feet across ancient floors. Eleanor stood at the window of the morning room, her hand resting upon the gentle swell of her belly where their second child grew, watching as Alexander chased their son James across the manicured lawn, the stern Duke of Ashworth reduced to playful growls and exaggerated stumbles that sent the dark-haired toddler into peals of delighted giggles. How different he was now from the severe, unapproachable man society had whispered about. Though Eleanor knew the world still saw only glimpses of his warmth, he remained reserved in company, formal in his dealings, but here, within the sanctuary of their family, he was transformed. A father who read stories in ridiculous voices and carried his son upon his shoulders and looked at Eleanor with an adoration that still made her breath catch after all this time. The Dowager Duchess had arrived that morning for her quarterly visit, and Eleanor could hear her sharp voice in the garden now, calling out encouragement to James, while simultaneously criticizing the gardener's handling of the rose beds, and she smiled at the old woman's particular brand of affection that expressed itself through imperious demands and thinly veiled pride. A letter had come from Eleanor's parents that week, full of gratitude they would never directly speak. Her father's debts had been quietly settled, the family estate restored to stability, all managed so discreetly by Alexander that society never knew the Viscount had been saved from ruin by his son-in-law's generosity. Her mother wrote of local news and parish gossip, but between the lines Eleanor read the peace of a woman no longer terrified of creditors and scandal, and she felt a rush of love for the husband who had done this without ever seeking acknowledgement or thanks. There was other news too, carried on the whispers of society and confirmed by occasional letters from acquaintances. Cordelia's marriage had continued its slow collapse. Marcus's gambling now common knowledge, his mistress installed in a house on the other side of London, and Cordelia herself grown bitter and sharp, her famous beauty fading under the weight of disappointment. Eleanor thought of her sister, sometimes with something that had softened from pity into a distant, complicated sorrow. They had not spoken since that ball 3 years ago, and Eleanor found she did not miss the relationship they had never truly had, though she hoped, in some quiet corner of her heart, that Cordelia might one day find whatever it was she had been seeking in all the wrong places. Alexander appeared in the doorway now, James perched upon his hip, both of them flushed and grass-stained and grinning, and Eleanor opened her arms to receive them, her family, her heart, her home, thinking of the frightened, wounded woman she had been when she first arrived in London, expecting nothing more than security, and finding instead this abundance of love that filled every room of the great house and every chamber of her heart. The library at Blackwood Manor had always been Eleanor's sanctuary, the place where she had first begun to glimpse the man behind the Duke's forbidding facade. And it was here, on a quiet evening, with autumn beginning to paint the trees beyond the tall windows in shades of amber and gold, that she found Alexander waiting for her, a familiar warmth in his eyes, as he set aside the papers he had been reviewing and opened his arms to welcome her into the space beside him, on the worn leather sofa they had claimed as their own. James was sleeping upstairs, exhausted from a day of adventure with his grandmother, and the new baby a daughter, they hoped, though Eleanor would welcome another son with equal joy, fluttered gently beneath her heart as she settled against her husband's side, feeling the steady rhythm of his breathing, the solid comfort of his presence that had become as necessary to her as air itself. "Do you remember," she asked softly, "when you first brought me here, showed me this room, and told me I might consider it my own?" Alexander's hand found hers, his fingers intertwining with hers in that gesture that had become as natural as breathing. "I remember thinking you were the first person who looked at the books rather than calculating their value," he said, his voice carrying that hint of wry humor that only she was privileged to hear. "I remember hoping—" He paused, and Eleanor tilted her head to look up at him, seeing the flicker of something vulnerable cross his features. Even now, even after all they had shared. "What did you hope?" she pressed gently, and he was quiet for a long moment before answering. "I hoped you might one day look at me the way you looked at those books," he admitted, with interest, with curiosity, with the desire to know what lay within, rather than merely what the cover presented to the world. Eleanor felt tears prick at her eyes, thinking of the guarded man who had proposed a practical arrangement while secretly harboring such tender, terrified hopes. "Your secret," she said, understanding flooding through her. "The one Cordelia said I did not know. It was never coldness at all, was it? It was hope. It was the fear of hoping." Alexander drew her closer, pressing a kiss to her temple. "I had been taught that love was weakness, that wanting was foolishness. But from the moment I saw you, truly saw you, I wanted with a desperation that terrified me. I told myself I offered you a practical arrangement because I could not bear to offer my heart and have it refused. The children's laughter would fill these halls again tomorrow. The dowager would offer her sharp-tongued wisdom. The world would continue with its demands and delights. But in this moment there was only the two of them, only this love that had grown, not from dramatic passion, but from something steadier, something built choice by choice, kindness by kindness, until it had become the foundation upon which their entire world rested. Eleanor reached up to touch her husband's face, drawing him down for a kiss that held all the promise of their first and all the depth of their years together, and she understood at last that love, true love, Lasting love was not a lightning strike, but a hearth fire, carefully tended, endlessly warming, illuminating everything it touched with gentle, steady, irreplaceable light. The autumn afternoon unfolded in shades of burnished gold and deep amber, the light falling soft and honeyed across the grounds of Blackwood Manor, where Eleanor sat upon a blanket spread beneath the great oak tree, watching her husband teach their son to identify the different leaves that drifted down around them, while the Dowager Duchess supervised from her chair nearby, wrapped in shawls and offering commentary that was equal parts criticism and adoration. This, Eleanor thought, as she rested her hands upon the swell, where their daughter, for the physician had confirmed it, just that morning grew strong and healthy. This was what happiness looked like when it was not the fleeting spark of infatuation, but the steady, sustaining flame of a life built with intention and care, and the daily choice to love, even when love required effort, required patience, required the surrender of pride and the embrace of vulnerability. She thought of the woman she had been 4 years ago, standing in her father's modest drawing room with her heart freshly shattered, believing that she had learned the truth about love, that it was a game played by the beautiful and the charming, a currency she did not possess, a door forever closed to plain, bookish, overlooked Eleanor Ashworth. How wrong she had been, and how grateful she was for that wrongness. For if Marcus Fairfax had wanted her, if Cordelia had not been cruel, she would never have found her way to this place, this man, this life that exceeded every dream she had been too wounded to allow herself to imagine. The greatest loves, she understood now, often began not with thunderbolts and racing pulses, but with respect, with kindness, with the willingness to see beyond surfaces, to the tender, frightened hearts that beat beneath even the most forbidding exteriors. Worth was not measured by the shallow judgments of ballrooms and drawing rooms, not determined by the set of one's features or the brightness of one's smile, but revealed through constancy, through compassion, through the 1,000 small choices that built a marriage into a fortress of mutual devotion. Alexander looked up then, catching her eye across the lawn, and the smile that transformed his severe features was a gift she would never tire of receiving, a secret shared between them, even in company, a promise renewed with every glance. He rose and came to her, settling beside her on the blanket, while James continued his leaf collection under his great-grandmother's watchful eye, and he took Eleanor's hand in his, pressing a kiss to her palm in that gesture that had become their private language of love. They sat together in comfortable silence, watching the light change across the land that would one day belong to their children and their children's children, and Eleanor felt a gratitude so profound it bordered on reverence for the path that had brought her here, through pain into joy, through resignation into passion, through a practical arrangement into the greatest love story she had ever known. Thank you, dear reader, for walking this path alongside Eleanor, for believing in the quiet magic of love that grows rather than simply strikes, for understanding that the happiest endings are not those that blaze brightest, but those that burn longest, warming all who gather near. May you find, or perhaps recognize already in your own life, the steady, transformative love that builds rather than merely ignites, that deepens with years rather than fading, that sees your truest self and chooses you, always, with intention and devotion and joy. Eleanor and Alexander walked on together through the golden afternoon, her hand in his, their children's laughter rising like music behind them, both knowing with perfect certainty that they held, in each other, everything that mattered.